On February 10, 2026, 9 days after Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, something happened inside a Bitcoin wallet that almost nobody noticed. It wasn't a major transaction or a dramatic financial move. A small sum was deposited into a Bitcoin wallet linked to Nancy Guthrie's ransom notes. And alongside that deposit, a single line of text appeared in the account. "We're ready to talk. Contact us." No names, no agencies, no confirmation of who sent it. Just those 6 words and a link, and then absolute silence for the next 77 days. That moment, that single transaction in a cryptocurrency account on February 10th, 2026 is the key event in this investigation that the media barely mentioned. It reveals something that press conferences simply left out, what official statements concealed, and what the sheriff's contradictions failed to show. It tells us how the FBI is actually handling this case, what their strategy is and why they made that decision about the Bitcoin, why they're applying the suspect profile in that very specific way, and what the silence after that message really means. I'm Brian Records. Brian Entin has been following this story since February 1st, and today we're going to tell the whole thing. Subscribe right now if you're new here. Like the video and leave a comment at the end. After hearing everything about the Bitcoin and the FBI's strategy, do you think they made the right call? I want to know what you think. Now let's get started. To understand the Bitcoin angle, you first need to grasp the real context behind the ransom note. Because even though many people know there were ransom notes, very few know the full picture of what those messages actually said, how they were delivered, and what they reveal about the psychology of whoever wrote them. The notes didn't arrive at the Guthrie family's attorney's office. They didn't come through police channels. They didn't show up in a sealed envelope sent to a private address that only someone close to the family would know. They were sent directly to local television stations in Arizona. 2 notes were sent to media outlets and public broadcasting organizations, the kind of institutions that exist to amplify information to the widest possible audience as quickly as possible. Think about what that delivery method tells us. When a real kidnapper sends a note, their primary goal is control. Control the information, control the timing, control who knows what and when. A real kidnapper doesn't want the public involved. They don't want law enforcement on high alert. They don't want cameras outside the victim's house or reporters asking questions. They want a quiet, private financial transaction that happens as fast as possible under the radar so they can take the money and vanish. Sending ransom notes to television stations is the exact opposite of that strategy. It is the loudest, most public, most media-driven delivery method that exists today. That guarantees the story explodes nationally. It ensures law enforcement is immediately on high alert. It guarantees that every forensic expert, behavioral analyst, and retired agent in the country starts publicly analyzing the case. For a kidnapper trying to collect quietly and disappear, this is the worst possible strategy. Which means that whoever sent those notes either didn't understand how a kidnapping works, something impossible, given the level of planning in this case, or understood perfectly how they work, and chose the public exposure deliberately. That deliberate choice was the starting point where the FBI's behavioral analysis team began building the suspect profile that Brian Entin has been reporting on. The profile. Brian Entin spoke with several retired FBI profilers about what the behavioral evidence in the Nancy Guthrie case says about the person responsible. And what those experts have described piece by piece over weeks of reporting builds a portrait of a suspect that is specific, consistent, and deeply unsettling. The starting point for any behavioral profile in cases like this is the statistics. Not because data replaces investigation, but because it tells you where to look first. And in the Nancy Guthrie case, the number profilers kept coming back to wasn't a detail specific to this case. It was a general truth about violent crime. 92%. That's the percentage of women murdered in this country who were killed by someone they knew. Not a stranger, not a random attacker. Someone familiar. Someone who crossed their path at some point, close enough to know their routines, their address, and their vulnerabilities. 92%. At this stage, investigators had not publicly confirmed that Nancy Guthrie had been murdered. Officially, she was still a missing person. But crimes of this magnitude don't happen in isolation. They follow patterns. By placing Nancy Guthrie's disappearance within the pattern of violence against elderly women, stalking behavior, command of the property, and security knowledge upon entry become key factors. The statistical weight of that 92% is simply impossible to ignore. It means that when building the suspect list, you don't start with strangers. You first look at the people Nancy knew. You start with those who visited her home, knew her routine, her schedule, and her security system. Someone who understood her environment well enough to plan an attack at 1:47 inches the morning with a signal jammer, a backpack, and a holstered weapon. That's not the behavior of someone who picks a house at random. We're talking about someone who already knew the inside of that house very well. That statistical reality that the captor almost certainly knew her is the foundation of the entire investigation. Every element of the FBI's criminal profile was built on that. This is where the profile gets specific, because the analysts who spoke with Brian Entin didn't simply describe a generic category of person. They detailed a behavioral signature, a pattern of decisions that, when examined, points toward a very specific type of suspect. That profile is as precise as it is disturbing. The first word that came up in nearly every conversation with analysts was fearless. Not careful, not cautious, not methodical, but without fear. Think about what that means in the context of a crime. An 4-year-old woman is abducted from her home in the middle of the night. The risks are very real. The danger of being seen, heard, or leaving any evidence was present at every moment of the abduction. Someone who feared the consequences of being caught would move with extreme caution and hesitation. They would act with a constant awareness that discovery was possible. But the intruder at Nancy's house didn't act that way. They moved with the confidence of someone who feels no fear, someone convinced that the probability of facing consequences was zero. And nobody reaches that level of confidence by chance. Profilers say that kind of confidence comes from one of two places. The first is experience. Having done it before, understanding the risks and knowing firsthand that it's possible to survive, that the system is vulnerable and escape is feasible. The second origin is even more dangerous than experience. Obsession. Obsession is different because it doesn't come from knowledge. It comes purely from emotion. It comes from someone so focused on their goal and so consumed by their need that the fear of consequences disappears. It's not that they analyzed and dismissed the risk, it's that the objective matters more to them than their own safety, more than their own freedom, or any possible future they might have. When obsession reaches that level, the subject stops asking the question that prevents most people from committing serious crimes. What will happen to me if I get caught? They stop asking not because they don't know the answer, but because they simply don't care anymore. We're talking about an extremely dangerous individual. That is the type of person the FBI's behavioral profile describes. In the Nancy Guthrie case, the suspect profile isn't limited to psychological traits alone. Manipulative intelligence. The ability to understand how an investigation works and fabricate evidence deliberately designed to mislead agents. Remember the ransom notes, the television stations, and the very public nature of the delivery. Someone who simply wanted to get money would never have made that kind of decision. But someone who understood that sending ransom notes to the press would immediately flood the investigation with noise, knew that making a public demand would shift investigators' attention toward a purely financial motive, steering them away from a personal one. That person would see exactly why going public was strategically valuable. They weren't looking for a payment, they were looking to deceive. Brian Entin discussed this with a former FBI agent who explained it clearly. A real kidnapper would never use the media because going public means losing all control over the information. You lose the ability to negotiate privately, and you invite maximum scrutiny possible. The only reason to make a ransom demand public is if money is not the real objective of the crime. When investigators accepted the possibility that the ransom was a fabricated distraction rather than a genuine demand, the meaning of that Bitcoin wallet changed completely. Because if the ransom was just a distraction, the Bitcoin wallet was just a prop. And that February 10th message, "We're ready to talk. Contact us," wasn't a real invitation to negotiate. It was another layer of the story they were fabricating. Another piece of a narrative designed to simulate a kidnapping, getting investigators to focus on money in order to buy time. Time for what? That's the question that changes everything. Let's talk now about the FBI's response, because this is where Brian Entin's reporting on the Bitcoin reveals something that's been widely misunderstood. Most people think the FBI ignored that Bitcoin wallet because they simply didn't take the ransom seriously. They didn't refuse because they have a policy against cryptocurrency payments. It wasn't due to disorganization or because the evidence pointed them in a different direction. They refused, because they understood with remarkable precision, something they never stated publicly, what that Bitcoin was actually for. Paying it, or even engaging with it in a way that suggested they believed the narrative, would have been a fatal tactical error. It would have handed the perpetrator exactly what they had been looking for from the very beginning. A retired FBI agent explained to Brian Entin the psychology behind this decision in terms worth understanding. He said that when you open a ransom negotiation, the first thing you establish is power, not emotion. No urgency, just power. The kidnapper holds one simple advantage: they have something you want. They believe your desperation will make you do anything. They think that state of anguish makes you easy to control. The FBI's countermove is equally simple. You're not the only ones who want something. We want you too. And when you accept money, or make a traceable transaction, any recorded communication or exchange that leaves a forensic trail, you'll be giving us something we don't have yet. You'll be giving us your identity. The agent described it as a zero-sum endgame. Both sides believe they hold the winning position. And the side that moves first, the one that shows desperation or acts out of pure emotion, that side loses. So the FBI didn't ignore the wallet. They engaged with it exactly once. One deposit, one message. We're ready to talk. Contact us. And after that, they simply waited. Not because they had nothing else to do, or because they had dismissed the ransom lead, but because they had just made their first move in a complex psychological game, and they were patiently waiting to see how the suspect would react. The response was absolute silence. And in a real kidnapping, prolonged silence is not normal. That's not how someone who wants money behaves. A cash-hungry kidnapper always responds. They push back, make counteroffers, and escalate the situation. They don't go quiet when the family tries to make first contact. The silence confirmed what the behavioral profile was already suggesting. This was not a genuine ransom negotiation. Whoever created that Bitcoin wallet and sent the letters to TV stations had no interest in collecting money. Something else was going on, something that the ransom was designed to deliberately conceal. And the FBI, by refusing to dig deeper into that wallet and rejecting any form of payment, by holding firm in their position, was sending their own message. We can see exactly what you're doing, and we're not going to play the game you designed. But here's the crucial part of what Brian Entin revealed about the Bitcoin decision. The part almost every media outlet missed: the FBI's refusal was not a passive decision. It was an active strategic choice, directly connected to how they're using the suspect profile. The profile describes someone who is fearless but not immune. A person who acts with an almost obsessive confidence. And yet they built an elaborate cover story using the ransom, the Bitcoin, and the public notes to distance themselves from their real motive. People like that, under the right psychological conditions, make mistakes. Not because they lack intelligence or cunning, but because the emotional weight of their actions never fully goes away. It stays with them. It grows over time. And as the weeks turn into months and the investigation presses forward, as the media keeps the story alive and the FBI quietly analyzes evidence at Quantico, the psychological pressure on that person intensifies. More pressure means inevitable changes in behavior. The FBI agents who built the profile told Brian Entin that a permanent subject with this profile under such intense scrutiny will sooner or later make a mistake that opens a new forensic opportunity. A search, an unusual message or movement contact with someone already on the FBI's radar. The FBI, by refusing to pay the ransom and by not giving this individual the resolution they were seeking, is playing it cold. They're deliberately keeping the pressure on, leaving the wound open, pushing the suspect's mental state toward a dark and dangerous edge, where mistakes become inevitable over time. The Bitcoin wasn't a financial decision, it was a behavioral analysis tool. Refusing the payment keeps the criminal in a state of constant tension, which for someone with this specific psychological profile represents one of the most powerful investigative levers the FBI has available today. Let's now talk about the proof of life, a critical factor for understanding not just the Bitcoin piece of this case, but every tactical decision made by investigators. Proof of life is without question the most important element in any real kidnapping negotiation. It is non-negotiable. It's the one thing a true kidnapper always delivers early on, because without it, there's no reason for the victim's family to agree to pay what's being demanded. Without proof of life, the family has no evidence that paying will guarantee the return of their loved one. Without it, the negotiation has no foundation. In the Nancy Guthrie case, that critical evidence never appeared. No photographs, no videos, no voice recordings, not a single handwritten note from Nancy herself. No independently verifiable communication confirming she was still alive after February 1, 2026. The notes appeared. The Bitcoin wallet was activated. The message was officially present. And amid all that activity and frantic ransom theater, there was never a single moment of clarity, where the perpetrator said, "Here's Nancy. She's alive. Look at today's newspaper she's holding. Here's your proof that payment will bring her back." But that absolute silence was not an oversight. Real kidnappers don't forget to send proof of life. They know perfectly well that evidence is their primary leverage. It's what justifies their demand. It's the only real proof that the victim can still be saved. It's the fundamental basis for any family to take the risk of agreeing to a financial ransom. The absence of proof of life in this case revealed something very specific and devastating to investigators. Either the perpetrators didn't have access to Nancy to film her, meaning they didn't actually have her in custody, implying that someone with details of the abduction sent the notes but didn't have control over the victim. Or, the absence was intentional, because providing proof of life would have required presenting Nancy right then and there. Something that was already impossible. A former FBI agent told Brian Entin directly, "They negotiated in bad faith from day one. Every step was in bad faith. The absence of evidence, the public notes, and the silence after the initial contact are all suspicious. None of this is consistent with how a real money-motivated kidnapping operates. Not at all. And when a federal agent with years of experience in kidnapping cases states that there was bad faith from day one, and that nothing about this ransom looks authentic, investigators cannot afford to ignore that professional assessment. Everything points to a truth that no one dares to say out loud, that the ransom was orchestrated after the fact. That whoever designed it was working backwards based on a tragic event that had already taken place. Creating a narrative of financial crime over something that was never financial to begin with, building a story designed to appear to be something it wasn't. Simulating one thing, while in reality, it was something else entirely. This is the question Brian Entin has been asking. Ever since the notes appeared, a doubt that his sources, the profilers, and his own analytical instincts have been developing. If this was never about money, if the ransom was a smokescreen and the Bitcoin just a cheap prop, if the public delivery was meant to generate media noise rather than negotiate a return, what was this really about? The expert profiler's answer takes this case into territory so unsettling that once you understand it, you can't look away. This may not have been about Nancy Guthrie at all. She may not even have been the primary target of the attack. She may have been just the means. Think for a moment about the position Nancy Guthrie held in the world. She is the mother of Savannah Guthrie, the anchor of one of the most watched morning programs in the United States. A woman whose face is seen by millions of people every single morning without fail. A public figure whose personal life has been under the intense scrutiny of the media for many years. Savannah Guthrie isn't just Nancy's daughter. She's someone with a massive national public presence. She's someone who, by virtue of her career, lives in the minds of millions who have never exchanged a word with her. Many have formed opinions about her, believing they share an intimate connection that in reality exists only in their heads. This invisible bond was formed over years of watching her appear on television every day. Experts explained to Brian Entin the effect that level of public exposure generates. Someone with Savannah Guthrie's fame doesn't just attract followers. She attracts dangerous fixations and very deep obsessions. Most of the time it's harmless. People who enjoy her work and feel genuine appreciation for her charismatic on-air personality. They follow her career with casual interest. However, in other cases, the admiration turns dark. This is what scientists call a parasocial obsession, a state where someone develops an emotional bond with a celebrity that they perceive as entirely mutual. This happens even though the relationship is one-sided. The public figure has never seen them or knows they exist. They've never actually spoken, but for the obsessed person, the bond is as real as any other in their life. They feel connected and seen. They believe that person understands them better than anyone in the real world. In certain cases, they feel offended, because when a comment or segment comes up that they interpret as a slight, the obsessed person takes it as a personal attack. They see it as an unforgivable betrayal or a direct insult. This emotional response isn't rational. It doesn't stem from any real interaction in the physical world. It's the rage of someone who believed in a relationship that never existed, projecting their hatred onto the person they hold responsible. That rage, they told Brian Entin, can be a motive, not a financial or logical one, something darker. An emotional, personal, and patient motive, capable of planning for months and executing the plan without a trace of doubt. If someone wanted to hurt Savannah Guthrie, not physically but by leaving a permanent wound that would never fully close, taking her mother would be the most devastating blow possible. A $1 million reward wouldn't fix it. FBI resources or national media attention couldn't heal that kind of loss. Because this wound isn't about money or the law, it's purely about a bond of love. By taking away the person you love most, the pain exceeds anything a legal system can offer. If the goal was to strike at Savannah out of pure obsession to cause the maximum possible psychological damage, the ransom notes to the media weren't a mistake. They were coldly calculated moves. They guaranteed Savannah would see them immediately. They ensured the news would be everywhere she looked. They turned a private grief into an inescapable public spectacle. The message wasn't in the words written. The message was in the act itself. This is where Brian Entin details specific behaviors within the suspect profile. This includes the pattern of actions left by an obsessive perpetrator motivated by personal feelings. These differentiate them from a typical kidnapper looking for money. Analysts found several behavioral markers. These traits point to this type of suspect. The first is the complete absence of escalation. A financial kidnapper typically escalates. They increase the pressure and set much tighter deadlines. They demand urgent payments when the initial contact fails. They never fade into absolute silence. But the person behind Nancy Guthrie's abduction vanished. After the February 10th Bitcoin transaction, there was nothing more. No further communications, no urgent demands, no trace of additional pressure. That lack of escalation reveals something fundamental. This individual was not waiting for a simple monetary payment. They had already gotten exactly what they wanted out of this whole situation. The act itself was the objective. The abduction, the disappearance, and knowing what they had done was enough satisfaction for them. Once the act was complete, there was nowhere left to escalate. The second marker is the public communication. Sending notes to television stations is not the behavior of someone seeking quiet money. It's exhibitionism. That attention was focused on Savannah Guthrie. She has the reach needed to take any story national. Her ability to amplify the news suggests that reaching her and making her react was the primary objective. The third marker is confidence in execution. The signal jammer and the prepared doors. Also, the knowledge of the security systems and the use of gloves throughout. This describes someone who was very prepared. This was not an impulse. It was coldly planned. But it was systematically prepared over time, with research and plans reflecting a sustained focus rather than an opportunistic decision. And the fourth indicator, the one the profile describes as the most psychologically revealing, is the silence. Not the silence of the ransom, but the personal silence. After an act of this magnitude, most perpetrators experience what scientists call emotional aftermath. A period of intense internal processing, guilt, fear, and relief. Or a mix of all of them that manifests in observable behavioral changes. They become withdrawn or suddenly sociable to hide it. They drink more or less. They avoid certain topics in conversation, or they obsessively follow the news coverage of the case. They make small behavioral mistakes, slight inconsistencies in their daily routine, in their communication patterns, and in the digital trail investigators track. The FBI's suspect profile, according to Brian Entin's reporting, specifies exactly what behavioral signatures investigators are looking for in the people close to this criminal case. Not just regarding physical evidence, but in how their behavior has changed since February 1st. Because someone who did something this significant, who planned it for months and executed it with precision, who built a false financial narrative to conceal their real motive, that person doesn't go back to normal. They can't. The emotional weight of what they've done doesn't allow for it. And the FBI is watching for where normal broke down. There's one dimension of this investigation that Brian Entin has been careful and precise about, and it concerns whether one or more people were involved in taking Nancy Guthrie. Former FBI Special Agent Jim Clemente analyzed the blood spatter evidence at Nancy Guthrie's entrance. He reached a conclusion that the behavioral profiling team found consistent with their own prior analysis. It was a single person, not a two-person operation, not a coordinated team, but one individual. Clementi's reasoning was specific. If two people had been involved in removing an 4-year-old woman from her home, one would have kept her controlled inside, while the other managed the entry and exit. A two-person operation minimizes the risk of the victim reaching a visible or audible location. It minimizes the physical struggle. It makes everything much cleaner, faster, and more controlled. But the blood at the front doorway tells a very different story. It tells the story of a single person managing a situation that at some point resulted in a struggle at the front of the property. One individual, and only one, doing this, planning it and executing all of it. Managing everything from the signal jammer to the prepared doors, the camera removal, and physical control of an 4-year-old woman. This describes someone with a very specific psychological profile, not just capable, but deeply committed. Committed enough to do it all alone. Committed enough not to involve anyone else, another witness, or another potential weak link. Someone who might break under pressure was simply not an option. That level of commitment points directly to the obsession theory. Whoever does this alone does it, because they need the solitude, because sharing the act would dilute the experience itself. Because this was something so personal that it simply didn't allow for any kind of outside collaboration. One person. One motive. 1 month of planning. One night in Tucson. And somewhere right now, that person is living with the weight of what they did. The FBI's profile is designed to notice that burden. Here's something Brian Entin reported that no one else was asking about at that precise moment. And it connects the behavioral profile with the digital evidence in a way that should unsettle anyone who still thinks this was random. The Google searches. In March 2025, 11 months before Nancy Guthrie disappeared, someone searched for images of her personal address. Photographs of the exterior of the property. The kind of searches someone makes when they want to understand what a specific building looks like from the outside before showing up there. Then between November 30th and December 1st, 2025, 60 days before the abduction, the same searches were made again. 2 rounds of digital reconnaissance, months apart, for the same residential address in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood. The FBI requested Google's IP records linked to those searches, the device that made them, the account connected to it, and that data is now in the hands of the investigators on this case. Now consider those digital searches within the context of the suspect profile. A random burglar doesn't research a specific address 11 months in advance. A financial kidnapper doesn't conduct digital reconnaissance sessions months apart. But someone driven by obsession, someone who has planned something very personal, someone who has prepared emotionally and logistically for something they've decided must happen, that person anticipates everything. That individual comes back to study every detail. They analyze the target digitally long before ever physically setting foot there. March 2025, November 2025, February 2026. 3 points on a timeline. That doesn't describe impulsive violence, but premeditated, patient, and emotional preparation. The kind of plan that takes nearly a year. The kind that only happens when the motivation is personal enough to sustain it for that long. And the FBI has the IP address of whoever searched that house on Google Images 11 months before Nancy Guthrie disappeared. Now let's address the question that many people following this case have been asking for weeks. A question that represents the most emotionally difficult possibility in this entire criminal investigation. If this was never about money, if the ransom was just a setup, if the Bitcoin was a sham and the silence after initial contact was intentional, what does that mean for Nancy Guthrie? This is where the starkest logic comes in. A real kidnapper needs their victim alive. She is their only leverage. The victim is the reason for payment. Without her safety, there is no negotiation and no money to collect. Genuine kidnappers have a very clear financial incentive to keep their hostage alive. But if this was never about money, if the ransom was designed to deceive rather than collect, then that financial incentive didn't exist. And without it, the calculation about Nancy's fate shifts in a direction investigators must now confront. Even as they publicly maintain that the case remains active, the profilers consulted by Brian Entin have approached this dark possibility with great caution. They said the behavioral evidence, the lack of contact, the absence of proof of life, the completion of the act, followed by absolute silence, points to the real objective having been achieved during the abduction itself. Not afterward, not contingent on payment, but at the very moment Nancy Guthrie was taken from her home. This doesn't mean they've given up. It doesn't mean the search has come to an end. It doesn't mean the family's hope is without basis. Other cases have had miraculous outcomes in far more extreme circumstances than this one. But it does mean that the FBI's current strategy isn't focused solely on trying to negotiate a possible return. It's focused on building a solid case, and prosecuting the person responsible. Whether or not Nancy has found the DNA at Quantico, the Google order, and the cell data, the psychological profile, and the Bitcoin wallet, tracking all of it is being assembled not just to find Nancy Guthrie, but to catch whoever did this. Because finding that person is the only path to any real answers. This is where everything the FBI has built, from the behavioral profile to the digital evidence and the Bitcoin strategy, converges with the forensic analysis into something very specific. The suspect profile Brian Entin has been reporting on is not just a theoretical document. It's an active investigative tool being applied in real time. It tells agents who to watch, what behavior to monitor, what digital footprint to prioritize, and which routine changes are truly significant, whose communication patterns require closer examination. And it does something additional that most people following the case fail to appreciate. It dramatically narrows the field. By combining the statistic that 92% knew their killer with the behavioral signature, the fearless obsession, and intimate knowledge of the victim's home. Alongside that capacity for patient planning, driven by a personal rather than financial motive, we're not talking about a large group of people. We're talking about someone specific. Someone in Nancy Guthrie's life or in Savannah Guthrie's orbit. Someone with enough access to know the address intimately but far enough removed to believe they wouldn't be immediately identified. Someone who had been incubating this plan for nearly a year before showing up at that front door at 1:47 inches the morning. The FBI knows. The psychological profile tells them exactly where to look. And the physical evidence, the DNA being processed right now at Quantico, or the hair samples being analyzed by Astria Forensics, will eventually provide the definitive answers that everyone is desperately searching for. This criminal investigation continues as each new forensic detail brings the truth a little closer to light. The digital trail assembled by the CAST unit is now being cross-referenced against every individual the profile identifies as a possible suspect. The investigation is no longer broad. It is now narrow and very precise. That is the kind of evidence-driven pursuit that ends in a courtroom. And the person for whom this profile was built, the one who sat in front of a screen in March 2025 and searched for photos of Nancy Guthrie's home, that individual is somewhere inside this closing net. Let's now recall something Brian Entin said, something that deserves to be heard in its full context, because it captures the human reality of this case better than any statistic. He mentioned that from the perspective of Nancy's family, of those who truly love her, who have spent 86 days not knowing where she is without calls or letters. Without any confirmed sign of life, the Bitcoin wallet is something no investigative strategy can fully account for. It represents an open door, a possible link to whoever has her. And every night that passes without using it, the family must live, knowing there's a door that hasn't been opened yet. Brian Entin said it clearly in his report. He fully understood why someone in that position, waking up at 3 inches the morning thinking about their mother and what she might be suffering, would want to go back to that digital wallet, inject more money into it, and push with far greater force. Would want to do anything that provokes a response. He understood that well. He then explained why the FBI's stance of holding back and not showing desperation is the right call, even if it's the hardest one to make. Because when negotiating with someone acting in bad faith, showing desperation gives them exactly what they want. And in this case, what the perpetrator seems to be looking for is attention, power, and to watch the Guthries' suffering play out on a national stage. Playing along feeds their objective instead of weakening it. The FBI is playing a long, harder game, a stance that from the outside looks like inaction but isn't, when in reality it's the most sophisticated form of action, holding firm, processing the DNA, building the behavioral case, watching where the profile points, and waiting for the mistake that will come. There's one final piece in Brian Entin's reporting that must be understood with its full weight because it speaks to what this case has cost beyond the forensic evidence. Savannah Guthrie is a television journalist, a natural communicator who has spent her career in front of cameras, explaining the world's most complex stories so that millions of people can understand them. She has not returned to that camera since her mother disappeared. She stepped away from her morning post because her mother is gone. She offered $1 million of her own money as a reward. She donated $500,000 more to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in her mother's name. For the families of other missing people who don't have her public platform and are struggling in silence. No cameras and no national coverage. Think about that donation in the middle of her own nightmare. With her mother missing for 86 days, living in uncertainty that money can't resolve, she still had the capacity to think about other families living in the same darkness. Other mothers and daughters waiting without answers. That is the reality behind every piece of evidence. Brian Entin has reported on every interview, every Bitcoin analysis, and every behavioral chart. Behind every forensic report from Quantico, there is a daughter who is still waiting. The FBI is using the suspect profile to corner whoever is responsible. The Bitcoin strategy maintains psychological pressure on someone who calculated everything in the dark and believed they would never be held accountable. The DNA at Quantico is being processed with advanced technology, the same technology that caught the Golden State Killer. And Brian Entin is still out there reporting, finding details that press conferences don't offer, recording what his sources confide in him, what analysts describe, and what the evidence reveals. This case is not cold. It never was. It's being built brick by brick, proof by proof. And the person the profile describes, the one who spent a year planning this, and carried it out alone, one February morning in Tucson, who invented that ransom hoax to buy distance, someone who has remained hidden in absolute silence ever since. That person is running out of road. The FBI already knows very well who they're looking for, and they're not looking away.